Thank you very much for a very nice lecture. You framed the lecture around the activator-inhibitor, maintenance and care type of framework, a la Turing. And as you pointed out, one need for this to work is the inhibitor having a much longer, long-range type of diffusion than the activators. Okay, short-range activation, long-range inhibitor. And for patterns of biological patterns at a smaller scale, it works beautiful. It's an approach that really comes to mind. But I would like to pick your brain a little bit. If you're working with a larger type of pattern, say an ecosystem type of pattern, okay? And where you say, okay, in there it doesn't come to mind, how to explain an organization on the basis of activation inhibition. So you say, okay, one could jump to a more thermodynamic type basis of thing, and say, well, if it was a closed system near equilibrium, you would say it will minimize free energy. But these systems are open systems far from equilibrium. And nevertheless, they do exist patterns in these things, or at least some of us think that, for example, in the organization of vegetation in a river basin, there are patterns. Any thoughts in what to look to investigate those patterns? One thought that has come strongly, more strongly than previously in recent years among some physicists anyway, has been maximum entropy production, not minimum, maximum entropy production. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm afraid particularly not, but this is not so small range like you think, because this is an embryo of 10,000 cells and 1.2 millimeters. But for us, it's very big. But if you think you might have a mountain, I guess, right, with the water falling down the hill, and
in the earth science,
and then you will have some stones that will oppose it. So I don't know, but I imagine that it you might find some way of doing it. I don't know, but no, I don't have an answer, but the amazing thing is that you do have these pairs, and that these substances need to react with each other to have this. So, but I would imagine that you can probably design something.
I do think it's one crucial problem in the sense that, well, you don't call it a small scale, but for somebody in the earth science, it's a very small scale. I mean, we're talking, when you talk about the river basin, it's a different type of thing. And in there, we are still missing that you have here very well explained.
Ulrike, you had,
yeah. The gradients that you showed were sort of formed in the embryo, right, from production. Yes. And what initiates actually the gradient in the beginning? Is it one single protein molecule that comes into the embryo when it forms on some membrane, or how do you initially trigger this gradient?
I started all this by showing cordon expressed on the dorsal side, but what puts cordon on that region? And that has to do with the entry of the sperm into the egg, and there is a rotation of the cortex of the egg that activates something called a Wnt signal just on the dorsal side. So it's a mechanical rotation of microtubules in the egg that determines that the organizer will form there, and then it's all self-adjusting after that. And so, yeah, we're also interested in this initiation of this with fertilization in the frog egg, but there's something but that is already all in the mother's egg, and the asymmetry comes from the sperm, and that determines the beginning.
Any other questions? Yes.
So the title of your talk was Deciphering Complexity in this system, and it seems like you've done a really magnificent job of figuring out how a pretty complicated system works. So from the point of view of the general theme of this meeting, is this the triumph of reductionism, or is it an example of complexity?
Well, it's yeah, well, we did it one molecule at the time over a period of 20 years.
Exactly.
So, but, and probably there are molecules missing in all this.
Okay,
so we
but
keep on imagining
one never expects to be perfect.
So like I said, this is like the Claude Bernard, very ancient type thing, going one gene at the time. You would think that, you could plug it into a computer and it would come out, but it actually, in the end, it's all due to biochemical insights. It's finding that one molecule binds to the next one, and that's how you can decipher it. I guess now with systems biology you will get proteins that vary together and they group together, but that's not the way that we actually did this. So, but embryologists have always thought of the embryo as a whole. So maybe that's part of the reason that we could put this together, but I don't know.
Marcelo, do you have a question? Oh. Any other? Oh, yes. Yeah.
I have a question. Do the initial stage of embryonic cell have a higher level of transcriptome or proteome complexity during the cell differentiation? If yes, and why?
Well, the cell differentiation depends on this gradient of BMP that has many other cofactors, but we can put different levels of BMP and you can get notochord and so yeah, it's all primed to be sensitive to this one gradient. Now, why do you use this one gradient at this particular stage? Well, it's universal. That I don't know why, but through evolution, all animals use this. Of course, plants don't, but all animals use this universal system. And some animals have lost cordon, but Drosophila has a very robust, and many insects have very robust cordon. Others animals have lost noggin. Drosophila doesn't have noggin, but still does it with cordon. And there are some animals that have lost cordon and do it with noggin. So it's all evolution. It's like gene gain and gene loss, like you study. And we think that gene loss is very important in this too.
Well, we have a coffee break, but we are finished about 10 minutes early, so should we meet back at 17:30? Yes. So should we then come back at 17:30, so we'll have extra 10 minutes, or right now? No. Right, yeah. I thought that was what we discussed this paper, but all right. So we have 10 minutes more for general discussions. Does anyone who want to make some comments, or those who have not had a chance to speak, this is your turn.
I would like to ask a question to Professor Hensch. When he told us that he now can measure the diameter of proton with 14 decimal signs approximately, something like that. Now, he told the size in terms of centimeter. And what is centimeter? Do we know it with absolute precision? Maybe what you measured is actual size of centimeters than proton. That's the question.
I had a little trouble understanding acoustically. How
yeah. Told us the size of proton, which is now measured in terms of a number, in terms of centimeter. It's 14 digits of whatever units.
So the question is, how do we know the units?
How we know the units?
Yeah, I think
I know units. H, C. They are not numbers.
Right. So length the unit of length has been abandoned. Instead, the speed of light has been defined.
Yes.
So measuring a length is equivalent to measuring a time.
Yes.
And the unit of time right now is based on the cesium atomic clock. And the best cesium clocks are good to a few times 10 to minus 16 relative uncertainty. So we cannot really measure the
Yes, yes. Now I
period
understand,
of an
yes.
optical clock in terms of our existing definition of the second, because the second isn't accurate enough.
Yes.
In the future, we will have to redefine the second to do justice to these new clocks.
Yes. Okay, now I understand. Thank you very much.
Do you hear me? Yes. As a biologist, I would like to ask what is perhaps a naive question to the physicist who I heard describe emergence, strong emergence, and complexity. And that is basically, is it unreasonable to think that whatever problem appears complex today or emergent, one day we will have a very well-adapted theory or point of view to describe it in a way that will be very satisfactory to either predict what we want to predict or cause what we want to cause? Or do you think there is something really intrinsic that we will never reach that stage? I'm thinking about what physics must have looked like before calculus was invented. And without, before that time, it must have seemed to require an infinite computing power to describe even relatively simple mechanical phenomenon. And then calculus came, and remarkably simple answers came by. So isn't there hope that the same thing will happen one day, and that in a way scientific progress is not asymptotic, but that we are only at the beginning of a curve that is still has a very large future for ascent?
Well, since you were looking at me while you asked the question, I'll attempt an answer. I think that indeed some problems which appear to be complex in the sense that one cannot calculate the answer to the problem, and that exhibit what would appear to be emergent phenomena, that is, phenomena that don't seem to be connected in any obvious way to the microscopic behavior of the system. I think it's quite reasonable to believe that some such phenomena may become transformed into what we might think of as being ordinary problems to which we can calculate the answers in what will become relatively straightforward ways. It's not clear that every problem will submit to that kind of calculational attack. If it really turns out that the only way you can calculate something is by having a computer that's bigger than the size of the visible universe, then I think it's a safe bet to say that such a problem will remain incalculable. It's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. The problem is that, or perhaps the wonderful thing is, that people are very clever, and they keep coming up with new ideas for how to attack problems that seem to be impossible to attack. And so I would never want to say that there are problems that will never yield to our ability to calculate them in an ordinary way. But at the same time, I certainly wouldn't want to promise that every problem will be of that sort.
That if we look at solution to problems, not as necessarily some sort of complete view of the problem, but the ability to predict or cause what is really useful to us, that then the chances increase that a new point of view may yield just that.
Yes, so certainly it may be that if all you want is certain kinds of properties, then you may be able to accept a more approximate solution. So for example, we had a presentation about diffusion, and I think diffusion is a wonderful example of where some simple ideas take a very complex problem and turn it into a relatively simple one, as long as what you want to know about the problem are relatively average results. But there are some things where those average results are still very difficult to get. For example, the example that I gave, high temperature superconductivity, it's a macroscopic effect, but it has been resistant to many, many years of theoretical attack. So some of the best people in the world have worked on the theory of this without coming up with a microscopic description of what causes high temperature superconductivity that would be satisfying in the same way that the explanation of low temperature superconductivity is. So again, some problems will be of that nature, where if you lower your expectations about what kind of a solution you want, then you'll be able to get one, but other problems apparently will not.
I'm impressed by when you say such problems have resisted many years. By this you mean 10 or 20 or maybe 50, but other problems have resisted hundreds of years and received remarkable solutions.
Yes, well, that's true. So if we think on a more global timescale, for example, the last theorem, what's called the last theorem of Fermat, resisted solution for centuries, but eventually was solved, although I think very few people can understand the proof. But nevertheless, if we are to believe the mathematicians who have looked at this, there is now a proof of this last theorem of Fermat. And so it may very well be that in the future some very clever theoretical physicist will come up with a solution to the problem of high temperature superconductivity that does not involve massive calculations of the sort that I'm working on in my laboratory and that other people are working on in their laboratories. So that could be. The unending ingenuity of the human spirit is something which I find wonderfully impressive.
Professor von Braun.
Yes, thank you. I'm intrigued by the question in the prologue, and would like to, by the question regarding analogy. We had the question before us, can a phenomenon be, for instance, complex from a biological point of view, but not from a physical one? Where do we stand on that question? Could maybe an esteemed biologist and an esteemed physicist comment how we interpret the discussion on that particular question of analogy at this point?
I have no answer, but I would like to get a clarification, perhaps from Jürgen, about just what you were thinking when you wrote that, or from Werner, whoever is responsible for that particular phrase. Perhaps we could get a little clarification about what you were thinking, and then maybe someone else can come up with an answer.
That was, as a matter of fact, not my idea to have the term analogy put into the main topic of our meeting. But I mean, from the point of view of philosophy of science, analogy is just a weak relationship between entities, methods, theories. It's just a weak relationship, nothing else. I mean, what we were discussing, dealing with complexity and with reduction and reductionism, these are much stronger topics in this area. I just filled the gap because we had that term in our main topic. But I don't think there's any, I mean, I don't know what the concept of analogy means in particular disciplines or fields like biology. Is it a term? Is it a concept which is part of a theory, or is it just a weak relationship?
I think Marcelo wants to.
I was the responsible to put this word. But I think we can come back with the beginning. It was invented by Aristotle, and it's very simple. The health is in the animal, is in the nature, is in the consequence of the origin, say Aristotle, and is in the doctor. The same reality is in different proportions, we can say. And in the origin is a proportion of numbers. 2, 4, 2, 4 is 2, 3, 6. And this is a proportion. We can say there are proportions in the figures, geometric figures, or there are proportions in numbers. And Aristotle say there are proportions in the forms of the things. And the forms are like the numbers. This is the idea. Of course, this is the beginning. Proportions. And I think it's a good question. We can find proportion between the elements of the physics, the atoms and the cell, or not.
I think I have a good understanding of what you're meaning by analogy. What I'm wondering still, though, is what would it mean for something to be complex in biology and simple in physics? As I think this was at least part of your question. And I guess the idea is if there was an analogy between a physical system and a biological system, could you have the biological system being complex while the physical system was simple and still maintain the idea of analogy? Is that part of what...
I mean, of course, I have distinguished between what is called a structural analogy and a functional analogy. But of course, this is again easy. A structural analogy might be between the atom and the planetary model of an atom. So there is some sort of an analogy, a structural one. And there's, of course, what we call a functional analogy, when two entities are interchangeable for a particular purpose. This has nothing to do from the very beginning with the concept of complexity. That's a new aspect which comes in. And there might be some sort of relation between what we call functional or structural analogy and the concept of complexity. But this again would mean we have to turn to some discipline or some field where both categories, both terms are used in the same context.
Okay, so that inspires me to think of an example that might address the question. So let's take the analogy between a solar system, planetary motion, and an atom. Now we know that there are a lot of differences, but there is a structural analogy there. The planetary system will, over the course of, that is our own planetary system, will over the course of billions of years be chaotic. That is, we will not be able to predict the detailed orbits of the planets. On the other hand, if I have a many electron system and put it into its ground state, it'll just stay there forever. There won't be any evolution of the system. It won't show any kind of time chaotic behavior. Now, maybe that's not the kind of thing that you were thinking of, but at least there would be two systems. They're both physics, but one of them is complex, and one of them is, well, I'm not sure whether simple is quite the right term for a many electron atom because it's hard for us to calculate it.
About mass and energy, or matter and energy. And these are different things in physics, or not?
I didn't want to answer that one, but I wanted to follow up on yours, which I found helpful. I think the limitations of structural analogy, I like actually the distinction between functional and structural, is that behavioral change and evolution happens with biological systems and less so or not with physical systems, and that may help to to focus actually research agendas. But I think analogy, I would conjecture, has great limitations between the two because of behavioral change mechanisms.
Well, just a quick one following up just from watching. I think what Gerhard Ertl showed is actually filling that gap to a certain degree, where you have these spirals evolving from a very simple system, CO plus O2 is relatively simple molecules on a platinum surface. So I think in general, sort of this biology versus physics is nowadays very common to make up this gap, and indeed you're missing out on chemistry, which is indeed sort of the discipline in between. We saw that earlier also from Martin Rees' presentation. I think that's the way natural sciences are staggered anyhow, and indeed I think that these kind of chemical systems may bridge these gaps quite efficiently and have these analogies in between of self-organization.
Well, I think if there's one thing that we can agree on, and it's always nice to find one thing that we can agree on, and that is that uncomplicated systems like CO and O2 can be complex in the way in which they behave. And I think that that was one of the questions that was raised, and that seems to be pretty well answered.
Okay, Dr. Cartier will have the last word. Oh, so sorry.
It is true that there is a lot of analogies through the sciences, that many things have similar way of modeling and so on. And the question is, are these analogies because we are smart scientists, or are these analyses because it's the only way you know how to model? And for instance, this morning, the lecture about the deluge of information and how to infer reality from statistics, makes you wonder, if with the capabilities that we have to compute, to organize information, etc., maybe there is another way to model and simulate phenomena which are not just writing equations and so on.
Or not? Is a matter or not? Have matter and energy or not? For example.
Well, I think that physicists have become used to thinking of matter and energy as the same thing. That is, while perhaps in the 19th century we distinguished between what was matter and what was energy, today we're much less insistent on drawing a sharp line between matter and energy. Yes, and dark energy, which seems to gravitate oppositely from ordinary matter and ordinary energy. So, yeah, I don't know anything about those things.
I think there's a good topic to discuss during coffee. Thank you.